All right, well, welcome everyone to EFA Talks, our monthly get-together with members and guests to talk about topics of concern in the digital rights space. I'm Rita Mack, Vice Chair of EFA and your host for today's talk, Neoliberalism, the Life World, and the Psychopathic Corporation, where we will examine the nature of the digital world and the crisis of embodiment. First, Electronic Frontiers Australia acknowledges and pays respect to past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thank you for joining us today. We so appreciate your support and interest. We would also like to thank ThoughtWorks and Robin for their continued support. It is a pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Aidan Ricketts, a prominent social and environmental activist, educator, academic and writer. He works as a lecturer at the School of Law and Justice at Southern Cross University. His 2012 book, The Activists Handbook, a step-by-step guide to participatory democracy, provides a really powerful guide for grassroots activism. And of course, Angus, who continues with his amazing work in digital rights space. Angus is EFA's Policy Committee Chair. He is a trade partner. He is a partner and trademarks attorney at Irish Bentley Lawyers, law lecturer and director and member of many organisations, including Queensland Council for Civil Liberties, Legal Forecast, QLS Innovation Committee, and the IP and Technology Committee. It's great to have you both on the panel today.
Morning.
Awesome. And just for everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. Now today, we are delving deeper into the innards of what is meant by rights. So before we focus on the digital environment, we will begin with the concept of rights and what that actually means. So I'm going to pass you straight on to Aidan.
Hey, so one of the things that sort of needs to be interrogated around this issue of rights is really what we're talking about, where rights come from. We live in a common law based legal system, so we have a couple of different sources of rights. Rights can come about as a result of positive legislation that enacts rights. Rights can come about because of regulation which restricts another person's right, for example. But the underlying concept of rights that we have in a common law system is what's sort of known as negative liberty or negative rights, which is a sort of a simple proposition that you have the right to do absolutely anything that hasn't been made illegal yet. And that's an important consideration, really, I've come to discover in the digital rights space, because you're dealing with a frontier, similar to space. If you imagine the idea of a frontier, if you're allowed to do absolutely anything that hasn't been made illegal yet, then in a sense, you're allowed to do absolutely anything in a frontier because they haven't got around to regulating it yet. And so I think that's where some of the problem arises with the digital world in relation, for example, the misuse of data, is until it is legislated upon, then there are no rules. And so in order to generate rights, rights for individuals on the digital frontier, we would need to actually be regulating, for example, the corporations.
So when we talk about so can we just go a little bit deeper about what rights are, what actually do they mean? If we're not talking about the digital space right now, we're just talking about out in the life world.
Well, I mean, that's the thing with rights. So you have this underlying negative liberty, the right to do absolutely anything that hasn't been made illegal yet, which in the life world is largely restricted. I mean, to use an example, if you want to, take the kids camping in a national park and go fishing, you probably need a registered car, a driver's license, a park entry permit, a camping permit and a fishing permit. So all of those things, which once would have just simply been part of our underlying liberty, have been regulated, by the state and by legislation. Then you have other sort of rights, which are rights to be free from something. So if you have the right to be free from racial discrimination or free from sexual discrimination, that's because we have a Racial Discrimination Act or a Sexual Discrimination Act, which has in effect curtailed other people's grand negative liberty in order to protect someone else. So there's that sort of, when it comes to legislating rights, sometimes we're creating a new right in the hands of one person by protecting them from the other person.
So are corporations the main beneficiaries of human rights?
Well, of course they absolutely shouldn't be. Corporations initially emerged in our legal system by way of a metaphor. The very, very early history, you had things like universities, hospitals, basic public institutions, and there was a problem that they couldn't exist in perpetuity, and they had to exist through human trustees who would die, and then there'd be a little bit of a vacuum of power for a while, and there was also sometimes problems of corruption with that. So the very, very first corporations were an attempt to give these public institutions immortality, in a sense, so that they could be recognised as a legal entity in their own right. That was usually done by specific charter from the state. The next stage was you had the emergence of a few business corporations, things like the British East India Company and so on, and some of the big railway companies that were being set up in America in the 19th century, that were set up again with a specific charter from the Crown to do a particular purpose. And although it might have been a business purpose, it was seen as being a public purpose as well, setting up railways or encouraging international trade. It was from there that business people started to become a little bit envious of this separate legal identity that the corporation had. So they started to try to mimic that with various contractual forms of what was known as joint stock companies. And then in the 1840s and 1850s, beginning in Britain, you had the passage of legislation, which for the first time enabled corporations to be set up by a manner and form formula under legislation. But where we got to then really is business, stepping towards the modern business corporation being recognised as a legal subject, and being possessed of most of the rights and privileges of the human legal subject. So the law starts to talk about natural persons being humans of the life world, to distinguish them from, these recognised artificial entities. Now, unfortunately, what began as a metaphor in which the judges were very, very clear that it was a metaphor for a particular purpose, ended up having a normative significance. So you get to a case, Westinghouse uranium case, I forget exactly when it was, but you got the House of Lords in London saying we can see no reason whatsoever why a formal legal person such as a corporation should not have the full suite of rights that a natural person has. Now, I can see a lot of reasons why a corporation should not get human rights, if we go into why humans get human rights in the first place. But unfortunately, as often happens with a metaphor, the metaphor sort of got stretched and became a normative proposition in its own right that suggested that unless you can prove a very strong reason otherwise, corporations are going to have all the rights of humans. Now, as bills of rights have emerged in countries other than Australia, and Canada being a good example because it got one fairly late in the piece, corporations ended up being the institutions that had the money, the access to lawyers, and the capacity to enforce those emerging human rights in their own interests. And so we've seen situations where, banks wanting to interfere with referendums about taxation in the United States were able to activate free speech rights under the American Constitution, where pharmaceutical companies actually ran a case in Canada where they argued that preventing them from trading on a Sunday was interfering with their was a religious interference with their freedom to trade. So it breached, religious freedoms. So corporations opportunistically jump into this space and claim human rights themselves.
Absolutely. So do you think that the law has become merely a set of rules for business people to manipulate?
Well, it's an organised system of violence fundamentally, but certainly it does create a big body of the law ends up being rules for business people, things like, you know, bankruptcy law and so on. Protects them. Corporations law in particular protects investors, but, you know, by a shield between them and the company itself.
So what's like the tension between the neoliberalism and our rights?
Well, I think we go back into the history here. Having created corporations, you know, back in the 1840s and 1850s, effectively business corporations, they've grown to become largely dominant governance institutions on the planet. In that, you know, quite a lot of nation states are smaller than a number of the corporations, for example. And one of the ways that corporations globally have been able to governments is with flight of capital. So they can effectively engineer a regulatory race to the bottom by, you know, running away from regimes that either impose new restrictions on them or don't relieve restrictions that they're getting relieved in other jurisdictions. So they've sort of grown effectively into these monsters. Now, the point of corporations, however, is although they were created as a metaphor to a natural person in the life world, they have a whole lot of differences. The biggest one, obviously, is they don't have a body. You had an old, you know, one of the House of Lords a very long time ago saying they have no soul to be damned, no body to be kicked. How could you expect them to have a conscience? And that's a very good observation. Lacking a body means they lack the vulnerabilities of humans, they lack mortality, they don't have families, they don't breathe air, they're not ecological beings, they're not related to the rest of the evolved life forms. So they are effectively these, you know, these institutions driven only by their internal charters, which, according to our law, mandates that those who are managing them must act in the interests of the corporation and its members. If you then sort of do a little bit of a comparison of what that really means for the artificial legal entity, the corporation, compared to the natural person, what you discover is that we've legally mandated sociopathic or psychopathic corporations, that basically they are these huge, powerful governance institutions which are only capable of acting in their own interest. A human who has no moral faculty, who is only capable of acting in their own interest, we tend to pathologise as a psychopath. So, you know, one of the big differences apart from humans having bodies is that humans have a moral faculty, humans have capacities for empathy and things like that. In fact, I actually believe our capacity for empathy derives from having a body, because we couldn't really empathise with something suffering unless we had already experienced having a body ourselves. So neoliberalism, in a sense, is a philosophical outgrowth of corporations. Classical liberalism really had a human basis, and so classical humanism also had a moral basis as well, with philosophers like Kant and so on. But when you move, you know, to the last 50 years, that corporate worldview of looking back at the human and planetary life world from the rarefied and artificial space of the corporation, it tends to only see things in its own instrumental terms. So the life world, the planet, is just resources. In fact, humans are just resources. And I've likened, whether it's strictly true or not, I've likened corporations to being a very early form of artificial intelligence. Precisely because we've personality, we've given them autonomy, but they absolutely lack the human moral faculty. Mind you, by the way, the human moral faculty can go good or bad, as we know, but at least it's there. So to give an example, when corporations look at humanity, I suggest that through the corporate eye, you would only see 4 types of humans. One would be managers, who can help manage the corporations, skilled managers. One would be employees who work for it. Another would be consumers who buy things off it. And the 4th category of humans would be entirely superfluous to it, would have no value whatsoever. And if you want to see where corporations have collectively treated humans as superfluous, we can look to Africa, for example, and the horrible scenario we had with AIDS drugs a number of years ago, where the purpose of the corporation was to sell AIDS drugs at a profit. And if the people of Africa didn't have enough money for that to happen, well, that was just bad luck.
I mean, so before we take it back into the to the digital world, and I'll bring in Angus, I just wanted to talk a little bit, Aidan, about your sort of comments when you sort of were introduced to the idea of digital rights.
Yes, when you first contacted me and talked about digital rights, as a law lecturer and perhaps a jurisprudential thinker, I sort of thought, digital rights, what do you mean? I didn't know we had any, and I think that stems from what I was saying earlier about my understanding of rights in a common law legal system as coming from those sort of different sources. And in a frontier situation, outer space or the digital frontier, as I've said, there's going to be a lack of regulation, and it's that lack of regulation that allows the first people to arrive there, and those people are probably corporations in this case. The first ones to arrive to do whatever they want. So, our concerns around personal data privacy, for example, we don't begin with a right to personal data privacy. They begin with a right to do anything that hasn't been regulated yet. So, in a sense, when we start talking about our rights to, say, personal data privacy, there's, to my thinking, there's a step prior, which we don't get rights to personal data privacy until we regulate that frontier, and regulate that frontier by imposing some restrictions on those corporations who've populated that frontier.
Yeah, because I mean, we all sort of assumed that our human rights was sort of supposed to do that. Angus, would you like to come in? And we just want to contrast, because before we move further, we just really want to contrast the rights in the outside of the digital world, and also then how that relates to our concept of digital rights.
Yeah, and I think Aidan's made some really, really important points. And like most frontiers, there is the first movers, and then there's the thinkers, and then there's the operators, and then eventually there's the regulators, which ultimately settles a series of rules, and people can then operate within those rules. And I think law as an enabler for people to manipulate those rules is an interesting concept in itself. From my perspective, this concept of psychopathic corporations interested me in the context of a thesis I wrote for my master's, which was studied in Stockholm, which is a different legal tradition to Australia. And that was in the context of a comparative study between Australia and the European Union as regards to the enforcement of intellectual property rights and the personal right to privacy. And in that context, I had to go down the rabbit hole that hasn't ended yet, which is the place of thinking about why we have law and how law is. And they're effectively the pillars, or the easy way of expressing what jurisprudence is, or legal philosophy. And I think the easiest way to tackle this and to understand this is traditionally, and I mean traditionally, people like Kant or Hobbes or Bentham, the old thinkers of law, drew lines in the way that law is thought about. The first being a concept called legal positivism, which is the idea that the body politic, politicians make law as a matter of fact, and those laws are then enforced, and that creates the parameters within which people operate, and the existence of law is identifiable by the existence of enforcement. The second school of thought is a concept of natural law theory, which is that law and morality are inseparable, and there's a higher purpose that require people to do certain things. Like, for example, there's a reason why a person would feel uncomfortable spitting on another person. There doesn't specifically need to be a law that says don't spit on other people. That's something that's inherent in people, or that you wouldn't take from another person's house. Is something that guides us morally and doesn't necessarily need to be expressed into writing. Criticisms of natural law theory obviously flow from there being a very teleological or religious basis behind that form of thinking. As we've moved into this new frontier, I think a couple of things need to be pointed out in the context of what digital rights are, or digital freedoms are. The first is the concept of freedoms, or an expressed series of propositions as regards to what could be expected as a human being, is a relatively new concept. And we are now trying to meld that relatively new concept into a very rapidly expanding frontier, being the digital world. In my view, the centre point of all human rights comes from two places. The first is an understanding, or at least an appreciation, that human life is something that should be conducted autonomously. So each person should be autonomous. And then the second proposition, that people should be dignified in their autonomy. As Aidan touched on, and I very strongly agree with, freedoms are somewhat of a fallacy. There's no absolute freedoms. Certain freedoms are curbed by certain other freedoms. For example, the freedom of movement is curbed by the freedom of privacy, not to have your home life invaded. So you're not free to move into another person's home because that person has private life. Centering these two concepts is the idea of human beings. And I understand Aidan's proposition of the life world to be the world in which we exist as natural beings. The corporation isn't a natural being. It's a legal fiction, or a creature that we've created that has legal personality, but not embodied physical personality. And I think that's a very interesting way of looking at the digital world. And I would draw a couple of distinctions in relation to what a corporation is and what a human is. And I could do this by looking at the Corporations Act and having a conversation like a lawyer. That might end up with people dropping off the Zoom call, and I would understand why. I think it's easier just to take the more straightforward propositions. So, for example, corporations are associated with humans. There's a director, there's a secretary, there are shareholders or members, but the corporation doesn't exercise in the same way as humans. It isn't embodied. So its exercise of its legal personality is different to the exercise of a human being. The second is corporations are created by the state. They're something that are legally able to have happen. They don't just come into existence. They come into existence by operation of law. The third is when they come into existence, they are voluntarily created. I don't think anyone here could say that they were voluntarily created in their own right. We're all involuntarily brought into this world. Corporations are deliberately brought into the world. The members of a corporation make the existence of a corporation, and because members can be replaced, a corporation is, as Aidan said, effectively an immortal creature. It doesn't have an end point. As long as it exists, it can continue to exist. And when it exists with those members or shareholders, but gives it perpetuity, those members or shareholders are unified to the company's purpose or for the existence of the company, which is different to other arrangements we have in society. And finally, and I think most operatively, corporations exist for purposes or for objects. One of the big concerns about corporations and the way that the corporate world is pushed is the object of most corporations is commercial gain or some form of financial benefit. There are corporations that are not for profit, and there are corporations that are philanthropic. And the inception of corporations back in the 17th and 18th century was for public good and for a public service and to give a name or an existence to a group of people operating for public benefit. The courts and the legislature over the last 200-300 years have dismorphed and altered that for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go through. Suffice to say, what we have now is a different creature to the creature at its inception. One of the conversation points we had on our previous EFA talks, we had the opportunity to speak with Professor Hudson Burden, who's a virologist and immunologist, was about the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. And I think that's a good example for pointing to what corporations are. The pharmaceutical companies, which I won't name, that are rolling out vaccines and making vaccines available to people, or governments who are making them available to people, are not doing that for the philanthropy or for the better interest of the human bodies that are capable of acquiring a virus. They are doing that because they have shareholders, and the shareholders have an interest in their existence because they derive a financial benefit from it. That detaches itself from the human world or the life world, as Aidan eloquently puts it, and puts them into a different sense where they don't have to feel physical repercussions to what they're doing. They only feel financial repercussions, and that allows them to operate purely for a purpose that isn't human rights focused. I think a really interesting thing that comes into this, Red, and then I'll throw back to you, is where the law recognises corporations in the same or similar way to human beings as regards human rights. In my research that I undertook in Sweden, part of the comparison was whether Australian corporations have human rights against corporations in the European Union. Australia doesn't really reflect human rights. I've described Australia's human rights law as immature against the European Union, and I mean that in the sense that Australia, for whatever reason, and I can insert a lot of criticism about Australia in this context, for whatever reason, Australia has not elected to properly ratify a human rights framework in the legislative sense. We've left it effectively as we trust the democratically elected not to abuse us, and therefore we don't need the rights. That's effectively the state of Australian law. In the UK, there's an interesting decision that happened at the turn of the millennium, decided or delivered in April 2000, which is the decision of the Queen and Broadcasting Standards Commission. I think Lord Mustill in that decision sums up the position, at least in the United Kingdom, about human rights and the corporate creature quite well. And I'll very briefly read a chunk from that because Lord Mustill's words are more eloquent than my own. He says, "There will, it is true, be many occasions where grounds for complaint maintainable by a company will be the same kind of those that could be presented by an individual as a breach of privacy. For example, the clandestine copying of business documents would be actionable by a company and an individual alike as civil wrongs, amounting to a breach of confidentiality, copyright, and the like. But, and then with my emphasis, privacy and confidentiality are not the same. For example, the reading and copying of personal diaries, letters to relatives or lovers, poems, and so on, could ground not only an allegation of tortuous conduct, but also an additional complaint objectionable not because legal rights have been infringed, but because of the insult done to the person as a person. No such complaint would, I believe, be feasible when made by a company, not for the obvious reason that a corporation does not create documents of this kind, but because an intrusion into such matters has an extra dimension in the shape of damage done to the sensibilities of the human being by exposing to strangers the workings of his or her inward feelings, emotions, fears, and beliefs. A damage which an artificial person having no sensibilities cannot be made to suffer. A company can have secrets, can have things which should be kept confidential, but I see this as different from the essential human and personal concept of privacy. And I think that's a really, really important distinction between the corporations that are effectively controlling the frontier that we're moving into, the digital world and the digital horizon that's rapidly expanding in front of us, not having the same sensibilities to be concerned about a loss of identity or concerned about hurt or insult as a consequence of comments made based on revealed secrets or personal information, and the people that are truly affected in that process. And it's an interesting conundrum that we're facing, not only in a digital rights or a digital space, but as a society generally, because we've pushed these boundaries without really understanding where the cliff exists, and we start falling off and our relevance becomes less and less about our individual rights and freedoms and the opportunities presented in a neoliberalistic sense to corporations that can exploit us and information about us for advertising or law enforcement gain.
Mm. And so this just goes on. So we've got that idea that that human rights in the physical world and in the digital world are paramount of importance in order to sort of even out the playing field of the corporation, which I think a lot of us assume that was what our rights was actually all about. But that's kind of been sort of pushed aside. Aidan, mind over matter. Can we talk a little bit more about why this has been pushed aside? And also, if we look at that concept of this disembodied mind, sort of making all these decisions disconnected from its body, which is you're disconnected then from empathy, how does that play out in the current state?
Okay, a couple of things there, and I was just going to continue on from Angus's discussion there about the essential difference in a natural person's interest in their own personal privacy and a corporation's secrets. To sort of talk about this idea that we have far too easily tried to draw an analogue from human rights to corporate rights, but one of the very big reasons why there is such thing human rights, in addition to the two reasons that Angus was giving, is because humans have bodies. Now, when you think about, for example, something like torture, it is impossible to torture a corporation. It is horribly easy to torture a human. psychologically as well as physically, because they have bodies. And so, you know, historically, one of the big drivers behind things like human rights is that, you know, that horror, that empathetic horror we have at torture, false imprisonment, incarceration, and so on. Similarly, you know, you can have a death penalty for humans. I've actually put a lot of thought into the death penalty for corporations. Strangely enough, it's one of the things we could do. We could legislatively dissolve a corporation which had committed too many social and environmental crimes by simply dissolving them on the stock exchange and transferring their shares to the regulator. But that's another whole topic. So we can, in a sense, do a desktop killing of them. But yes, they can't experience torture, grief, sadness, loss, any of those things. So trying to do analogues of human rights from corporations, from humans to corporations, doesn't work, yet unfortunately it's one of the things that's been done. So this, you know, draws us into your question, really, this issue of embodiment. And the other thing I was going to say, a common question that's come up for me, because, you know, I did a thesis about the amoral or sociopathic nature of the corporation, and the most common response, and probably some of the participants are thinking it now, are saying, yeah, you're saying all this about corporations being artificial entities and so on, but aren't corporations just run by humans? And there is a very good answer to that. Although corporations are run by humans, they need human agents to run them. The managers who run corporations occupy roles. And something we know about humans is when they occupy roles, they often, as part of occupying that role, particularly as a professional, they will often put their own moral faculty to one side. Now, that might occur if they're a Gestapo guard. That might occur if they're a soldier. That might occur if they're a policeman. It occurs to a lawyer. A defence lawyer will have their own professional moral system. For example, when they're defending rapists and serial killers, which might be very different. Their professional moral system might be very different to their personal moral system. So we need to be very clear that although corporations, as these sociopathic entities, might be run by real live humans who might have real live human moral faculties, they don't necessarily bring that moral faculty to the job of being a CEO or a company director, because it wouldn't be professional, it wouldn't be legally acceptable even. There's a number of cases where directors have fallen foul of the law because they've been too charitable. So that is the answer to that, to say, yes, look, corporations only act with the hands of humans, but those already have had their moral faculty truncated by virtue of the role that they occupy.
Absolutely. I'm just going to go to the question that we've got from Milan. Thank you for putting a question in. I think we might have answered a bit of it, but I'd like to just read out the question. Aren't constructs like the corporation and even laws and the legal system that enable such constructs only expressed through the thoughts and actions of people? Therefore, aren't the evils of corporations more appropriately characterised as the evils of the individuals that run them, which you've sort of talked about? Is the real imperative here to erode the obstruction of individual liability and responsibility created by the corporate veil?
If I can jump on that one.
I think Aidan, you sort of answered. Does anyone want to add a little bit more to that?
Yeah, Aidan answered it very, very well, I think. And I'd only just add a slight different flavour onto this. So I think Aidan's answer about the obfuscation of human interests, or the change of human interests when they're in different roles, is critically important. That once you've detached your body from something and you're thinking from your mind rather than from your heart, for example, as a director of a company, you are capable of doing greater evil than if you were operating in your own agency. And there's plenty of examples of that. The Stanford prison experiment is a prime example, where people were told, you're a prisoner, you're a guard, and they were left alone. The people who were guards began abusing the prisoners because they had a sense of heightened power. The same kind of thing with corporations, particularly where you're rewarded financially effectively for actions that are less and less moral or connected to the human agency or human rights of those you're affecting. And an easy example of that directly in practice is modern slavery. It's a commercial interest to have cheap labour in a developing country, to have your textiles manufactured, to be able to sell at a greater profit. The greater profit is the incentive, not necessarily the elevation of basic human living conditions. But I think there's an interesting point in this question as well, and generally in this interaction, and that is, what role do human rights have more specifically and more generally? So in Australia, we have some rights protections like the Privacy Act that allows recourse against public entities. In Queensland, we have the same kind of concept that rights are available to exercise against public entities. The way that the world has evolved and the power that is now with corporations, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, for example, in the way that they provide not only the infrastructure that we operate on, but the environment within which we operate in. The role of human rights, I see, is to bolster or to safeguard or to at least allow a check and balance in an attitudinal sense or in a legal sense, or both preferably, that allows humans to say, no, you've pushed me too far, or you've exceeded what your bounds are.
Yeah.
Human rights as they check and balance against corporations is really, really critically important. So not running parallel with corporations, but running against corporations in the sense that the actions of this corporation operating without empathy have affected me as an individual human being, or me as a class of individual human beings, should have recourse against that corporation. And there are tools within various legislative frameworks here in Australia and elsewhere in the world that do allow effectively corporations to be punished for stepping over the mark. And the Modern Slavery Act in Australia is an example of that. There are plenty of other examples in antitrust or anti-competition law, and there's quite a bit in terms of the abolishment of slavery in other parts of the world that are more heavily affected by slavery for a longer period of time than here in Australia. But they're not the same thing as a human rights protection specifically, that is, this must stop and this comes to an end because you've affected human beings in a way that is immoral and thus unacceptable, whether that exists in law or otherwise.
Excellent. Just want to quickly just put that idea out, that what happens when digital data completely overrides the life world? What can you see as sort of happening there, Aidan?
Yes, well, I might step back a little bit to this idea of the life world. It derives from Habermas, and one of the things Habermas was telling us is that as we start to develop abstract institutions in the human life world, such as government, such as law, such as corporations, such as our economy, that they originate in the life world and they originally reflect the life world, but as they grow in abstraction, they grow in disembodiment until eventually the separation of the abstract institutions of governance from the life world becomes semi-complete or complete, at which point there's a turnaround where those governance institutions will begin to re-manipulate or recolonize the life world. And that's one of the things that we see as particularly problematic. So we've been talking about how a corporation gets its own internal raison d'etre in terms of, the pursuit of profit. We have a huge problem, for example, with an economy based on perpetual growth on a finite planet. And again, I think corporations have a hand in that, because in the old days when you had a family corner shop, quite often businesses were subsistence, in that if that corner shop paid that family's subsistence, that's all it had. It didn't need, like a company does, to keep expanding and expanding and expanding in order to give dividends to shareholders. So it didn't need to open a chain of corner shops then and franchises. But corporations, in a sense, have been a driving force behind this perpetual growth economy, because that's something they need within their stock exchanges and their need to constantly create not just the same profits as last year's, but bigger ones. So there's been this reordering of the life world from abstraction. And I think that's the big issue. You were asking me before about the cult of the disembodied mind and so on. There's two things sort of going on here. One is humans have generated governance institutions which are abstract, and there's nothing wrong with that in the first instance, provided they're adequately reflecting the life world. But when they become so abstract that they begin to recolonise or reorganise the life world, they can do so in completely terminal ways. So, and climate change is an example of how we've been doing that. and it's having disastrous consequences. And we'll continue to have those mistakes unless, we recapture, a necessary link between the life world and our governance institutions, and begin to conform with. I mean, one of my jokes to people is the most radical political and economic position you can hold at the moment is that you just want a society and an economy that obeys the laws of physics. If you ask for that, you're an extreme greenie. It's terrible, and you'll destroy the economy. But in reality, it's the other way around. So there's this real danger of this increasing abstraction that reorganises the life world, and I think we're seeing that. And then the other thing that's reorganising the life world, of course, is, as partly an outcome of that, is the digital space, is the cyber world, which is largely a disembodied world, a world that appeals to humans in their minds and not necessarily in their bodies. Now, I'm going deeper and deeper into this concept of embodiment because I've actually come to believe that our intelligence arises within our entire body, and not simply in our heads and simply in our brains. There's two things coming together here, is the increasing abstractification of our lives through things like corporations and through the cyber world, and a slightly longer history of what I call the cult of the disembodied mind within our dominant culture anyway. So whether it's the Judeo-Christian sort of idea of spirit versus, good spirit versus bad flesh, or whether it's a post-enlightenment idea of pure rationality versus emotion, or just a very sort of postmodernist and egotistical view of, the world is as I describe it using language, rather than, no, the world actually does exist. It's not created by language. Like I often point to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And I sort of go, well, you have to think to exist. Thinking's something you do when you already exist. So we've got this big tradition of trying to sort of glorify the human mind disconnected from its body, disconnected from its passion, disconnected from its vulnerabilities. So I think you start to bring three things together here. You bring that intellectual tradition of mind over matter, of the mind over the body, together with the abstractification of institutions, particularly corporations and our economy, and then the emergence of the digital space, which really promises that disembodied mind great power, the ability to do whatever it wants, to have virtual realities, to go virtually traveling in nature, to have virtual sex, and it's like it offers it this release from its body, which is attractive to that disembodied mind. But I think there's terrible dangers in all of that, because ultimately this is the life world. Ultimately, this is the planet Gaia. Ultimately, we are born, we have cells, we breathe air, and the further we go in that abstractification process, the more we recolonizing ourselves, ignoring the Earth governance principles that already exist in physics and supplementing those with our own, currency speculation, perpetual growth, and cyber reality. So, there's three things really coming together here, which are potentially problematic.
Yeah, so what we're seeing, like with what we're discussing, we're just going to wrap it up a bit before I pass it back to Angus, is that we know that neoliberalism, basically everything within that neoliberal framework is designed to exploit us, to exploit individuals within that framework. And we're talking here that we have this real clash when we talk about corporations, because there's lack of ethics, there's lack of morals, and there's no empathy. And so even though you may have individuals who have those qualities and those values, it doesn't translate within that sort of corporate structure. Hence why digital rights and our rights are just so important. That's what we do here at EFA. We really got to get digital rights up there to help us forward in this. But another thing is that if we have that kind of uncertainty within us participating in the live world, then all this sort of confusion and bias and problems will just be amplified within the digital space, where there is no real rights existing at all. So can we just end on that, Angus? And also just, I think the questions are kind of like that clash, isn't it? Or that sort of between the corporate lack of morals and what we have.
I'll grab this in answer to the question and to wrap this up from my perspective. I'm happily and proudly a human being, and I am very grateful that there are people watching this. And all that I'd ask is that people continue conversations like this. It's a difficult concept to grasp, and it's a difficult space to be thinking in, but it's critically important for the future that we're having these thoughts and discussions now, rather than just flying down the stream and hoping that it ends in a happier place and not a waterfall that we tumble off. In the context of why companies might choose to do things that give the perception of better employment opportunities or more sustainable futures, that is a market-driven approach. The company is reacting to what the market is requiring, or at least it's predicting what the market will require in the future and what it will need to sustain its ongoing existence. We, as human beings in the life world, are effectively the dictators of anything that happens in any other world, because we are still what creates all of this. The legal fictions that give rise to companies, the infrastructure that gives rise to the ability for us to disembody and connect across the internet where we are faceless behind keyboards, still comes from the part that we are all human interacting in a society. Where we can get change here is firstly respecting your own human rights, and then respecting the human rights of others. So giving other people the opportunity to speak in a way that you might not agree with, giving the opportunity for people to test thoughts in spaces without deep criticism, for the purpose of exploring where potential paths might go, and being tolerant of different viewpoints, because different viewpoints put together often ends up with the best possible next step. All of that happens because of conversation. The corporations cannot exist without a market. If the conversation ends in a place that is, we choose not to support a company that operates for profit driven by slavery in North Africa, that company will have to do one of two things: either end or alter its operation. And companies generally will alter operation before choosing to end. So we have the power, and we have the power even more so in a democratic society to adjust the will of the legislature or the direction of the legislature. And as Aidan said, the parameters and the four walls of the law, in a more legal positivistic sense than the natural law sense I've just said, allows us to say, we don't tolerate these things, and we should have these frameworks that protect us in these ways, including against corporations. And the long-standing position of Electronic Frontiers Australia has been an appropriate recourse to that would be the introduction of an enforceable federal human rights framework, and a tort for serious invasion of privacy as checks against the operations of corporations, and to shift the attitude that corporations might have in this country. But of all of this, take from this an interesting discussion and continue the discussion. And I very much look forward to continuing discussion myself with Aidan about these topics into the future, and to future EFA talks. Thanks, Rita.
Yeah. Aidan, was there anything else you wanted to quickly add before we...
There was a note I was going to make about commodification in there. Not so much a global wrap-up, but part of this abstraction, it's in the nature of corporations to commodify more and more and more of the life world, and talking about in the digital space. So our data has become a commodity. Our attention has become a commodity which is traded. In the same way that intellectual property, so new forms of property are constantly emerging as corporations, establish, modify things. So, and that's where, perhaps stepping back from it, we have to be very, very cautious of where this abstractification is going, and that's right too. And yeah, so I think the answers come from our bodies. The answers come from our grounding in the life world. We were talking about jurisprudence before. There's a new branch of jurisprudence emerging called earth jurisprudence.
Yeah.
Different activism, and it says, hey guys, wisen up. There's already a set of governance principles that you are bound by, and physics is chief among them. So if you're going to have a system, no matter how abstract, you'd better make sure it complies with the governance principles of the planet you are on, its climate system, and the nature of your own body. So, Earth Laws is really asking us to come back from that brink of terminal abstractification, to say, well, look, if we are going to reinvent ourselves in any way, it has to be driven from the wisdom inherent in the body and the wisdom inherent in the planet. And interesting, that wisdom is often, located in Indigenous communities. And, one of the points I make is this cult of the mind over matter is often also associated with the race sexist cult of kind of, excluding and down valuing the experiences of women and Indigenous people in particular. It's a lot of the embodiment philosophies that we can get from those sources, which have been the first casualties of that abstractification process.
Well, thank you very much, Aidan Ricketts, for joining us today on EFA Talks. And Angus, it's a pleasure as always. A big thank you, of course, to ThoughtWorks and Robin for your ongoing support to make these talks happen. EFA Talks will be back next month. If you're not a member, please join us. Check out our website, efa.org.au. EFA is an independent, non-profit association that relies on membership, subscriptions and donations. If you're concerned about digital rights in Australia, please join or donate today. Also, please let us know if you have any comments or topics that interest you. Get in contact with us through our website, because we would absolutely love to hear from you. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.